All right. Hello, everyone. Hopefully we're all doing well out there. Um, just here to present my article that I've shared with you. Hopefully you've had the opportunity to take a look at it. It's a pretty cool article. Um, it's a bit complex at certain points. Admittedly, I had a hard time with parts of it, but um, hopefully, uh, hopefully I can help explain. Um, Basically what's going on in this article. So, title of the article is "Shaping Academic Task Engagement with Percentile Schedules." So, the authors were Athens, Vollmer, and Pipkin, and they had just primarily two purposes within the study. But I'm going to really focus more on one of them, which was um, they wanted to examine the use of percentile schedules as a method of quantifying the shaping procedure in an educational setting. So I thought this was pretty cool because I mean we hear about this shaping within our class and things like that, but I personally haven't seen a whole lot of at least within our field of school psychology articles and research that use shaping. Um, in an educational setting or shaping behaviors. So this is a cool article that they use these percentile schedules as a way to quantify that shaping procedure and really show its effectiveness within the educational setting. So just kind of to start off within the methods, the participants that they had were four children that were referred for intervention, uh, one of them being a 6-year-old girl, two 9-year-old boys, and a 14-year-old boy. They all had different learning, speech, language, motor, and other health disabilities. Um, so it was just the four students with varying um, degrees of disabilities, and the setting that ultimately was used for the actual experiment was a room resembling their classroom. So it had desks and tables and whiteboards, etc. And the sessions took place 2 to 3 sessions daily, and it was like 4 to 5 days per week. So they were getting these sessions pretty frequently throughout the week, throughout their school week. So before actually doing all the experimental side of things, there was some pre-session training, and part of this included doing the IOA type stuff with the observers. The observers were graduate students. In the article, they talk about. I think they typically name them as therapists, but the therapists and the researchers, they did some preference assessment with each of the students, and they used 8 edible items. They were candy, and they came to 6 most preferred items that would be made available during a token exchange. And they decided to use a token exchange so that they didn't have to interrupt the sessions anytime that the criterion was met for reinforcement. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but essentially the idea is that they would receive the tokens, and then after the session, they'd be able to use the tokens to obtain the reinforcement. Um, so they did the preference assessment, and then they taught the token exchange to the students. So they explained the rules of how it worked. There was a bowl on the table where the tokens would be placed. Um, the um, the therapist then modeled what that looked like and how the tokens would be exchanged for the candy after the session, and then the students or the participants also had the opportunity to use that non-contingent token to obtain the reinforcement, just as kind of like a practice. And I include non-contingent here because the students were not told exactly how they would obtain the tokens, only that they would at certain points during the sessions. So after all that pre-session training, the baseline session occurred. And within these sessions, they were slightly different based on each of the 4 students. They each had unique tasks that had been identified by their teachers. So like writing, copying notes, and tracing. And it just depended again on which student. Um, the 3 younger students had 5-minute sessions, and the oldest student, I think the 14-year-old, had a 10-minute session. In the baseline sessions, they were only told, you can work if you want to. At the end of the session, you can exchange any tokens you receive for candy. So kind of just, again, following those rules of the token exchange. So throughout the session, they were given the opportunity to work on those tasks, and the tokens were delivered non-contingently. So every 2.5 minutes, a token would be placed in their bowl, regardless if they were on task or not. So within the experimental sessions, they were relatively similar to the baseline sessions, but the main difference was that there was a terminal criterion, meaning that the session would continue throughout the 5 or 10 minutes, unless at least 80% of the session spent, at least 80% of the session was spent engaged on the task for a minimum of 3 consecutive sessions. So essentially, they would have to be on task 80% of the time, 3 sessions in a row. And it didn't, as far as I could tell, none of the students were actually able to obtain that. But that criterion was set in case it worked too well, I guess, the reinforcement. The other difference was that the reinforcement, instead of being on a fixed reinforcement schedule, was now on this percentile schedule. And so I'll explain what this percentile schedule is here in the following slides, because it's a bit complex. It's not something that we've learned about, I guess, within this course, or really anything that I've heard of. So we'll jump into that. So I'll try to explain this as best as I can. Like I said, it was a bit complex within the article, but the percentile schedule essentially is they've got this formula that they use in order to determine how frequently the reinforcer should be given. Now, I've got the formula here. This K equals, in parentheses, m plus 1 times, in parentheses, 1 minus W. So I've got down here the explanations of each of these variables. W is the density of reinforcement. They didn't really explain this a whole lot. They did give references to other articles where they talked about this more. As far as I could tell, this is a ratio of whatever the variable is that you're concerned with, how much that's occurring. And so then essentially how often it should be reinforced. This M was the set number of recently ranked observations. So this was a number that they determined prior to applying the percentile schedule. And I'll explain this a little bit more in the later slides as well. And then this K, ultimately what they're trying to solve this formula for is the value for the upcoming response must exceed this value in order to obtain the reinforcer. So essentially, what this is it's a changing value that kind of allows this shaping to occur, this kind of structured shaping. And in order for the participant to receive the reinforcer, this value must be exceeded. And again, we've got an example coming up here to better explain this. So we've got the formula. Again, these are the values that they determined. So with the W, or the density of reinforcement, this they set at 0.5 for all of the instances, and this was, again, they chose this based on another article, some other research that had determined that was a good um, value here. 5 was the set number of observations that needed to occur, and then ranked those observations. So we go through the math, and what this gives us, this K, they explained that in order to receive reinforcement during the current observation, it needed to exceed the value of the current third ranked observation. Now, they suggest rounding down this in order to not make the criterion so stringent. So again, hopefully you're sticking with me. Maybe we're not quite there yet, but I've got more examples of what exactly this is and how exactly they're applying it within the study. So we've got here one of the examples that was actually done within the study for Tony. So they first start out with the baseline, and again, the reinforcement was given non-contingently. So we've got during the first session, he was on task for 0 seconds. Second session, 43 seconds, etc. And then they ranked them. So 62 seconds was the longest. So it was ranked here at the 5th position. 0 was the shortest amount of time, so it was ranked here at the 1st position. Now, when they started the experimental sessions, they set the initial criteria determined by the baseline. So based on the baseline, in this case, it was 3 seconds. So, well, again, it's a bit complex here, but what exactly is going on? But essentially, we've got our formula all solved here. They, for this instance, they determined that they were going to use the 5 ranked observations. And what that meant was, following that formula, was that in order to receive the reinforcer, it needed to exceed the value of the current 3rd ranked observation. So in the first 3 sessions or responses, the criteria was the 3 seconds, because we had not obtained a ranked observation quite yet. So in these 3 instances, it was 3 seconds, and we can see each of these 3 times it was above that 3 seconds. Now, this 4th response was the first opportunity to exceed the 3rd ranked. So at this point, the 3rd ranked observation was this 9 seconds, because that was the highest. Now, we move into our 5th observation, and our 3rd ranked at this point would be 4, and that exceeds it, so they would have received reinforcement. Now, at this will now be, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That would have been the 5th observation. Yep. Then the 6th observation, 6th response, would be the first time that this full ranked criteria is being used here. So at this point, we've got the previous 5 observations, and previous 5 observations, and this is now the criteria that must be exceeded in order to receive reinforcement. So at this point, it doesn't exceed it, and no reinforcement is given. And then they kind of move on and show how the percentile criteria is changing. So in the next response, it was 12 seconds on task, and we use this 4 again for our criteria, the receive reinforcement. Now we get rid of the oldest response, and these become our new criteria. So in this instance, the criteria stayed the same. It was the third ranked scale was 4 each time. Um, yeah, so hopefully makes a little bit of sense. They ultimately talked about how it was a bit complex. They needed obviously the therapist to um, do the calculations, etc. But they did have a handheld computer. So this was 2007. I'm not quite sure exactly what that would have been. I'm sure some sort of Palm Pilot or something like that. Um, but they were able to input the formula, um, you know, determine what values they were going to use, and then the computer would solve it for them. So it would start the sessions and it would start timing, and it would know, and it would actually show as well what rank was currently being used, and then once that current response session exceeded that criteria, it would indicate that, and then the therapist would be able to cue the teacher for that reinforcement. So I'll talk a little bit about the results here. I do have all of the uh, graphs here that they used. I probably won't go through every single one, but we'll use some of them for examples. What they gave the individual results for every single student. And they go quite in depth into um, all the different details about what the students were going through, and like they give you all the information. The main kind of takeaways though from the results were that um, these variations of the percentile schedule proved more effective than others, and I'll kind of explain this here. So we can see that prior to each experimental session is a baseline session where they were doing that non-contingent reinforcement. And here we've got the total duration of those sessions. Here, this dotted line is the average response criteria for reinforcement. And then we've got the sessions down here. A lot of sessions that they were going through. So again, each of these sessions, the time was determined previously. I believe for this student, these were the 10-minute sessions. And we'll see, I can use this as a comparison. The structure that they use in terms of which value is being input into the formula is not consistent through the students. They literally use the word semi-random. They do explain their process about how they determined which student would receive which when, but it wasn't very structured. I guess I could say that. So we'll go back here and we can see that each of these different values, each of the variations on the formula kind of gave different results, and that was consistent for each of the cases. Now go back here to the results. What they do mention is that the percentile schedule in this study was most effective with a large number of observations being taken into account. In other words, they had a large M. So for these, the largest M were these M equals 20 sessions. So what this meant was that they were taking into account 20 observations in order to determine the criteria that was being set. Ultimately, that K value ends up being smaller than that. I believe it ends up being, for these situations, I think around 10 sessions that are being ranked, and or sorry, it's the 10th session that must be exceeded in order to receive reinforcement. But anyway, we can see, with the criteria changing here within most of these situations where the M equaled 20, it was more sensitive and it kind of fit better with the responses of the students. You can see here in these, especially these small ones, um, the criteria kind of jumps and is more difficult for the student to achieve. Again, we can see that here in the M equals 10. And again, that seemed pretty consistent through all the students. However, these M equals 20 proved to be at least the most effective with these students. So they kind of cite very frequently this Lamb et al. Study of 2005. It's a smoking study where they were using percentile schedules to reduce smoking behavior in adults. And they mentioned that they kind of got the opposite result in this study, being that in the smoking study, it was a smaller M that proved more effective for the smoking behavior in adults. So hopefully, a lot of this has made sense. I know it's kind of a short time to explain kind of a new and complex topic, but um, how does this relevant to us within our ABA class? I think kind of the most obvious thing is that we're talking about shaping, and we just talked about that within this last week. Um, but it becomes more relevant in terms of our applied sense. So with traditional shaping, it's a powerful behavioral strategy, I guess you could say, to promote changes in current behavioral repertoires, right? So we're kind of promoting change in behaviors that are essentially already happening or could already happen. But the difficulty that comes up with that is that there's often sudden within session decisions that we have to make. So, like with the example of these students, we could potentially run into the difficulty of like, when do we reinforce? When do we give them that token? Was 10 seconds on task enough? What is that too little? Is it too much? What should we be expecting out of them? The benefit of using this percentile schedule, at least from what I have understood from the article, is that it kind of takes away that guesswork and it gives us this very structured way that literally tells us as we're doing the observations and the experimental sessions where they should be at in terms of receiving that reinforcement. Really, kind of this structured, quantified shaping process. Now, they mention its use within academic engagement as well as smoking, that those smoking behaviors that were mentioned in the other study. They also mention some self-care skills. So this being useful in teaching certain self-care skills. And I think, really, when we talk about children, but also on-task behaviors, I think that can be applied in a lot of different settings and in a lot of different behaviors. On task is useful in schools. It's useful in jobs. It's kind of a very desirable behavior in our day and age. So I think, at least personally, I thought this was a cool article that explained maybe more of a modern approach to shaping that I had never really heard of before, that I could see could be really useful in my personal pursuits as a school psychologist and in other settings as well. This study was done in 2007, and I did notice that there have been a lot of other studies that do use this percentile schedule within the same types of academic engagement behaviors. So kind of cool that this was probably one of the first, if not the first study to do this within this setting and see it kind of take off. So here I've got my reference. I'd ask for questions, but you're not here. And I think I've probably gone over my time limit a little bit, but hopefully we'll see y'all again soon.